Morning, everybody. Eric Chaconis here for the PT on Ice Daily Show. I am one of the members of the team from the Extremity Management course, along with Lindsay Huey and Mark Gallant. Lindsay and Mark teach that course all over the country. I actually don't go out. You're not going to see me on the road teaching that course anymore, but I still help out. And we've got a few open courses for the rest of the year, and then jumping into next year, we'll have a bunch of options for you. But if you're in the Iowa area, Mark will be in Ames, Iowa, November 12th. And then he will be in Asheville, North Carolina at Jim Gregory's clinic, Movement for Life, November 19th. So those are the two ones we have coming up to finish off the year for open courses. And then in the next part of the year, early January 14th, Lindsay will be at Onward Philly. And so that'll be kicking off 2023. Couple of announcements. Today is the last day you can sign up for Vice for this quarter. And so check out the website, ptonice.com. Vice is a really awesome value, high value continuing education option. If you like online continuing education, you want something that you can kind of just tune into once a week. Once a week, you've got a different speaker on a different topic. So if you see some of the posts that Jeff has done lately on Facebook and Instagram, kind of previewing some of the speakers for this year coming up, ICE is a huge value. It's only $25 a month, and you really do get a lot out of it. So the topic for today, what I want to discuss is related to tendon pain. And this interests me because I was at the AOMP conference last week in San Diego, and really great talk from Jill Cook. So, Jill Cook is a tendon researcher from Australia, and she came to AMP, was one of the keynote speakers to present on a lot of her research related to tendon pain. So it's always nice to hear people like her. Every few years, you get all the updates on kind of what summarized really in one talk on what these research are learning, what they're discovering related to tendon pain. So for me, it's been really fun to follow the science related to tendinopathy and tendon-related pain. I went to PT school in 2002, from 2002 to 2005. And back then, we just called it tendonitis. Some people would say, oh, is it a tendinosis when it's in the more chronic, non-inflammatory phase? But it was thought of as an inflammatory condition, tendonitis, that was treated with a lot of passive interventions. So corticosteroid injections were super popular. Unfortunately, they're still a little bit popular. But these passive interventions with the goal of reducing tendon pain by calming the inflammation down. From a rehab perspective, you saw a lot of stuff like iontophoresis and phonophoresis, ultrasound, e-stim modalities. Cross-fiction massage was really popular. We thought that we were stimulating the tendon fibers by massaging them in a perpendicular fashion, that we were remodeling the tissue, remodeling the collagen, and that ended up not being the case. So kind of interesting to see the history of all this. And then really around that time, it was actually around when I graduated PT school, when I was kind of in PT school, eccentrics were getting really popular. You had Dr. Alfredson out of Sweden, who was an orthopedic surgeon, is an orthopedic surgeon out of Sweden, who developed this protocol for Achilles and patella tendinopathy, where essentially you would load them with eccentric only training, pushing them into pain, trying to provoke the symptoms. And the idea was same thing. You're remodeling that tissue. You're remodeling the tendon, with this load. And so that was the right idea. That turned out to be the right idea. I think what we've learned since then is an eccentric only program, or exclusively doing eccentrics or jumping right into eccentrics, is probably not necessary. There's really not a huge difference between an eccentric only program as far as what the tendon feels in a progressive loading program. And so kind of interesting to see sort of that evolve. And that's really, I got a lot out of Jill's talk that I want to share with you today. And then I want to share some of the newer research that she's just published recently and talk a little bit about that. So it's all kind of based on this continuum model of tendon pathology, where the tendon begins to swell early on. She would call that the reactive phase, where it begins to swell. It increases in size. We do know that tendons get thicker. When they become painful, they oftentimes get thicker. And then there starts this breakdown of disrepair and eventual degeneration. In some cases, the tendon will rupture. The challenge with that model is it doesn't really correlate with symptoms, right? So you've got a lot of people who go through that process but never ever have tendon pain. So that's kind of interesting. I mean, we see the same thing with osteoarthritis. We see the same thing with pathology of the spine, and we see it all over the body, right? Pathology does not equal pain. We've known that for some time now. But kind of interesting to see this idea that when they look at people who have a complete tendon rupture, only like 34% of those people had previous tendon symptoms. So there's people going through that continuum of pathology but never have any symptoms. That's kind of interesting. Who gets pain, who doesn't? I mean, that's obviously a lot more than just the pathology needs to be considered. The other thing that we've learned from a lot of the work that Jill Cook has done is this is by far clearly a systemic problem, right? And so we've known that for quite some time. Your lipid panel is super important for tendinopathy. Your BMI is super important, not because of load on the tendon, because of the whole system. And maybe it's a chronic inflammatory microvascular issue, just like diabetes and heart disease, right? So that makes sense as well. The more unhealthy the person is, the more unhealthy the tendon tissue is. That's obvious. You can apply that to every single tissue in the body. The new work that she has done, and what I'm gonna see if Jeff can put this in Hump Day Hustling so you can see it. Just came out in BJSM a couple of days ago. But what they're looking at now is that interstitial swelling. So when you look at tendon pressure, internal tendon pressure, perhaps that has something to do with symptoms and perhaps has something to do with pathology. You see that throughout the body, right? Your intracranial pressure, your brain can only take so much intracranial pressure. Your muscle tissue can only take so much pressure. Think of compartment syndromes. We see it with nerves. When you have nerve pathology, you see swelling inside the nerve that can only take so much pressure. So there's this idea of TTP, total tendon pressure, where you have this internal pressure inside the tendon that potentially can lead to symptoms and potentially kind of take us down this path of the continuum of pathology. The other thing to think about, and this really hit home for me in Jill's talk, and I've heard her say this before, but I've never heard her really. I guess maybe my mind, you hear people say stuff and sometimes it doesn't register, but the topic of compression is critical. And so when you think of all these tendons, it's actually really not so much a tendinopathy as it is the enthesis. So is it an enthesopathy, right? The enthesitis, inflammation of a tendon where it attaches to the bone tissue, that's really where the problem is because of compression. So think of it at the Achilles. When you look at the attachment site at the calcaneal tubercle, when you go into full dorsiflexion, perhaps that's compressing, and it is compressing against the back of the calcaneus. Glute med in gluteal tendinopathy would be a great example. Fall into femoral adduction and internal rotation. As that Trendelenburg kind of starts to occur, you've got that glute med tendon wrapping around the greater trochanter of the hip, compressing at that location, right, where the greater trochanter meets the glute med tendon. So that's compression there. You see it at supraspinatus, where supraspinatus attaches to the greater tubercle in the shoulder. If you fall into shoulder extension, as you bring the shoulder back, same deal. You're compressing, or hand behind the back would really do it, right? Compressing that tendon against the greater tubercle where it attaches at the enthesis. Biceps long head would be another good example. She talks about this in the paper that just came out. Biceps long head, proximal in the bicipital groove, same deal. When you load that biceps in that extended position, maybe that is compressive to that tendon. And that compressive load seems to contribute to changes in the tendon matrix and potentially increases in tendon pressure. So maybe that does contribute to the swelling. It's kind of an interesting concept, interesting phenomenon. That hasn't really, I was very surprised to learn that hasn't really been discussed very much at all. This idea of intratendinous pressure potentially leading to symptoms. To me, I think that this helps us, reminds us to not get away from mechanics. Mechanics still matter. Biomechanics still matter. And if I have somebody who maybe lacks ankle dorsiflexion and they've got Achilles tendinopathy, well, it makes sense. Maybe there's some alterations to the way that tendon is loading at the enthesis. Maybe where it's compressing against the back of the calcaneus is contributing, and perhaps that's one of the factors that's contributing to it, right? Mechanics for the glute med tendon would be an easy one. They've got a Trendelenburg, and that hip is dropping into that position, and maybe that's compressing. Maybe that's something that I want to address, whether it's through mobility training or strength training, neurological training, right? Neuromotor control is all really important. But the big thing, the key takeaway that I always get when I listen to Jill, when I read her work, is you're not loading the pathology. You're not trying to correct the pathology. That's why all these passive interventions are really pretty pointless. Unless you have something that you're just trying to reduce the pain so that it can begin to take load, that I think you could argue might have some benefit. But generally speaking, trying to change the structure of the tendon, trying to correct the disrepair through PRP, platelet-rich plasma injections, we've already learned from the literature that is not the way to go. That's not a value-add procedure. The idea that we as physical therapists through manual therapy or whatever it is that we're doing, trying to change the tensile properties or change the structure of the tendon, you're not really doing that. You're loading the healthy part of the tendon. So what she says is you've got the donut, right? The hole in the middle of the donut is the pathology. That's the damaged area of the tendon. Don't treat the hole, treat the donut. Treat the good tissue that's around it. You load that tissue, makes that tissue more resilient, more stiff, more able to take load. That reduces their symptoms. That improves function. And the worst thing you can do is have them rest. Rest is catabolic. I think that's a really important thing to remember. Rest is catabolic. Load is anabolic. We want to load these individuals. We want good, healthy tensile force going through that tendon tissue because it makes them more resilient. It improves the kinetic chain. Obviously, the muscle tissue is going through a catabolic state when you're resting, so you'd like to reverse that. You want load because load is anabolic. Load is anabolic, and I'm not saying anabolic just for the tendon tissue, like you're going to grow the tendon tissue or strengthen the tendon tissue. I'm saying load is anabolic for the entire system. It's anabolic for the nervous system. Think of Ebony Rio's work. Think of tendon neuroplastic training, where we're trying to reduce that neurological inhibition, trying to improve cortical plasticity as it relates to movement, because that has an anabolic effect on the body. And so you're going to see more improvements in function, reductions in pain when you load them with tendon neuroplastic training. So I think it's anabolic to the nervous system. I think it's anabolic to the muscle tissue. I think it's anabolic to the bone tissue, anabolic to their psychology, right? Because they feel better because they can actually do stuff. So the physical therapists that are pushing people, that are taking people who have these types of conditions and saying, I don't want you to rest. I need you to smart loading. I need you progressive loading. Those are really the people you want to see. You don't want the people that are saying, hey, don't do that anymore. Hey, that hurts. Don't do that anymore. Avoid that. You need to rest. You need to take a month off. That can be helpful in a very short duration of time, but you better get them back really quick after that. And there's a lot of alternative things that you can do. Pain relieving, low level loading things that you can do, like isometric training that you can do early on instead of just complete rest, right? Complete rest is probably not the way to go. So hope that helps. I'm going to make sure that that paper is published in the Hump Day Hustling for hopefully this week, if not next week. And we'll talk to you soon. Take care, everybody.